We are Myth Vision. Welcome back, everybody. Your host, Eric Lambert. I brought two infamous total heretics to the table today. We have James Steven Valliant, author of Creating Christ. You can see his book on the screen. Make sure you guys get that book, read it, check the evidence. If you hate it, and for some reason you don't like what it says, he's open to critique and he's willing to challenge those people who think otherwise. And for those of you who are aware of the other guests that we've had, Jacob Berman, he has a book I wish was titled God the Father Has a Father, and he might just title it that by the time we get there. How are you guys doing?
Great.
Doing great.
Yeah, it's good to be here again.
I'm glad you guys are back, man, and bringing you two together, two scholars that I really enjoy bringing here into this discussion that I do not know much about. I'm here to learn. I'm going to be a schoolboy. I do know of certain ideas you're going to propose, but I wouldn't act like I have a clue what I'm talking about. So I'm going to pass this over to you guys, but I do know it has something to do with Jesus. That's pretty much what everything I do does, huh?
Of course it does.
Right?
Yeah.
Well, guys, go ahead and
all
dig
roads
in.
lead to Jesus, yeah.
Yes, sir.
Oh, yeah.
Well, I just wanted to say, just from the outset, the title of Jacob's book is so cool, right? Father of God. Just thinking about or I could almost put it in a Nietzsche sense, the genealogy of God, because God, is where we end, right? He's the creator of the universe. No. There's a whole backstory to God. I love it. I love the title.
Oh, thank you, man. And yeah, my book's going to cover all three of the religion's origins: Judaism's origins, then Christianity's origins, then Islam's origins.
Right.
One at a time.
Taking it all on.
Taking it all on. That's right. But yeah, so recently I showed you I also put it on my profile, the coin of Ptolemy, the 4 Philopater. And we talked about that the trident is on there, and it's very similar to how it connects over to the Flavian dolphin symbology. And I also noticed that it was a solar radiant crown when I looked at the coin that I showed you. And the way, and anyone can see this on the screen, the way those rays are pointing up looks like thorns. It's so thick lined that really look a lot like thorns. And it goes really well with the stuff I was talking about already in the previous videos, that King Bazus he is part of the Ptolemaic bloodline, and I mentioned that in the Bereshith Rabbi, he's called the son. His father is Atus the First, is called the son of Ptolemy, and that was referring to Ptolemy Menneus, or also known as Ptolemy Bar Menneus. He was the king of Chalcis. But yeah, what do you think about that? Similar symbology on the coin with the Flavian dolphin and the trident thing.
I think that there is no question that the Ptolemies were a ideological source for Roman emperors and their own propaganda. I think that they were an intellectual source, and for independent reasons, I think they were an intellectual source for Christianity. We cover in our own book, Creating Christ, the important role of Serapis, sort of the syncretistic god created by the Ptolemies, which sort of fuses Egyptian gods and Greek gods, several Greek gods, into a single new deity, fusing gods from different cultures. And in this case, with Serapis, you've got the healer god Asclepius, who was both the son of a mortal woman and a god, Apollo, and was himself a healer and resurrecting god. So even as a man in his human incarnation, he resurrected people from the dead. This vexed the gods. They struck him dead. At the request of his god father, the god Apollo, he was resurrected himself and enjoyed an apotheosis to become a god. And Asclepius, we're told by ancient sources, is one of the gods that Serapis is fused into, which explains why Vespasian, for example, the Flavian emperor, performed healing miracles very similar to those of Jesus at the Serapean when he was in Alexandria in Egypt, the temple of Serapis. So I believe that Serapis is a direct and his, if you will, you would talk about the parentage of gods. The father of one of the fathers of Serapis is this Asclepius, and another is Osiris, who enjoyed his own resurrection by the Egyptian god, who was chopped up into bits and put back, reassembled, and resurrected by his wife Isis. And seeing that connection, that ideological connection between Osiris and Asclepius, only further confirms the relationship between the healer, resurrector god Serapis and Jesus in my mind. So, and to me, the Flavians, these Roman emperors, are in fact the link that sort of shows that that was operative at the time. So,
Absolutely.
Both emperors, even before the Flavians, as well as the Flavians, used Ptolemaic imagery, used Ptolemaic ideas and religion, used the precedent that Ptolemies, because they were right, the last dynasty of pharaohs were not Egyptian at all. The last dynasty of Egyptian pharaohs were of Greek descent, descended from Ptolemy I, one of Alexander the Great's generals, and they sort of integrated Greek and Egyptian culture together. And that's what the Romans were doing, right? They were integrating a bunch of foreign cultures with their own. And one of the great precedents were the Ptolemies.
And what I find...
go on. So I'm sorry to keep... you got to shut me up at some point.
Okay, all right. All right. So what I found to be interesting is that Dionysus and Osiris both descended to the underworld. And Dionysus also ascended to Olympus after he resurrected from the dead. Asclepius resurrected from the dead. He also ascends up there to Orion. He gets ascended by Zeus as a constellation. He also walked on water.
Walks on water, right.
Yes. And in the Egyptian language, they called the constellation of Orion Sahu. And Sahu was often synchronized with Osiris. And since Osiris is synchronized with Serapis, it goes a long way of showing how the walking on water connection snuck its way in there with the massive synchronicity going on with the religiosity of Serapis.
Yeah. Anytime you see a hero descend into the underworld and return, that is a very ominous indicator of what the religion probably means conceptually to its devotees. Here we have the god or the demigod who's actually harrowed hell, as some mythographers put it. They've gone to the other side and they've come back to tell us. So they know the way and they know the way back. And so they can tell us, the pitfalls to avoid and the things to look for. And this makes them afterlife heroes that can offer a happy afterlife to their worshipers.
Absolutely.
Very interesting. Just like Christianity.
Yeah, and it goes a long way of showing that Dionysus also, when he descended to the underworld, he rescued his mother, Semele, from Hades.
His mortal mother.
Mortal mother, yeah.
Dionysus was a god who had a mortal mother.
Yeah, and Jesus descended to the underworld to rescue Adam.
Right.
Yeah,
in tradition.
Exactly the same story. And
that blows me away, guys. That I mean, there's so many. I guess if you want to get nitpicky and try to assume that these stories don't correlate in any way, it just becomes a little absurd to me to suppose. I get that there's the pushback of the zeitgeist addendum type stuff, like, hey, everybody was born on 25th of December and everybody, was crucified on a cross and everybody was named Christos Messiah, or, but the overall theme of these mythos are all about the same idea, so to speak. I mean, there's different details. Like, one of the creation myths might have a turtle or a snake involved, or the other one might have some other. I mean, they're all little details that differ. But when you take a satellite view and you look down and you go, you know what, these are very much similar. Now, Christian apologists would jump on this, and I've noticed this too. Like, I've heard this from great guys like Ravi Zacharias. I was a huge fan of his in the Christian apologetics movement, but he's a fundamentalist too. And I used to listen to his apologetics and use them when I was a Christian combating those who didn't believe. And he would say, fundamentally, they are diametrically opposed, and superficially they're similar. And instead of saying superficially they're opposed and at the fundamentals they're similar, I think fundamentally they are similar. The details fundamentally may speak different language, like in Buddhism and Christianity.
The basic theoretical structure of the religion is very much the same. We have a savior God who can ensure us a better afterlife. And this is not unique to Christianity. So the basic structure of what Christianity is doing, offering a happy afterlife, in effect, is the basic structure shared by many previous cults. And we can hear echoes of it, as I say, just in the myth of the hero or the god, harrowing hell, going to the underworld and returning. That obviously suggests that this hero has certain knowledge about the other side, or can offer a hope to his devotees for a better afterlife. So if you're denying that Christianity follows into this basic structure of what we call mystery religions, you're fighting gravity as far as I'm concerned. Christianity was simply Christianity was simply, you could see it's a Greco-Roman kind of thing. It was following the form of popular religions of its time, which basically had that superstructure around it, and increasingly so. After the certain international, back in really prehistoric times, religion and national identity, ethnic identity were closely linked. After the conquests of Alexander the Great, the spreading of Greek culture, the interaction after centuries of trade and people comparing notes about their cultures and religion, there began to be an increasing movement to identify one god with another god that it pre-existed Christianity. So what we were just saying about Serapis, for example, the unification of Asclepius, Apollo, and Hades and Zeus, being cross-identifying him with Osiris, Apis, and the bull Apis, and to turn him into a single deity that can be represented in different ways, Serapis, this process even has a name, Syncretism. So those Christian apologists who say, well, it has similarities, well, that's really all that the syncretists are saying. We're saying that there are echoes, right, through all these religions, and that the echo is not anything unique to Christianity. Exactly. In other words, salvation itself is not some unique promise that Christianity uniquely offers. Even a suffering savior God is not a unique promise at all.
Right.
Most of these deities suffered on earth, were martyred on earth, often executed, torn to pieces, various gruesome, gory ways of dying, but only to enjoy resurrection and apotheosis of their own, which points to better hopes for their own devotees' afterlife.
And what will be hard, what will be hard for these apologists to get around is that you look at Emperor Hadrian's biography and the autobiography and the Augustan history, it quite clearly as day says that the worshippers of Serapis call themselves Christians. And it's quite clear that what was going on during the era of Josephus, and especially when Josephus was writing his stuff down, that Jesus was being used as a replacement of Serapis. And he inherited the miracles of Serapis. And he was historicizing the first century context, was given the contents and attributes of other people that lived throughout the first century, before the Jewish war, during the Jewish war. Right. It brings me to what Daniel T. Unterbrink was talking about when he talks about Judas the Galilean. Right. And I noticed that when I look at the Gnostic text, it says Judas Iscariot was crucified, not Jesus. Such as the Gospel of Barnabas is a fine example of one of the different texts that's saying this. And it said that Judas was, if I remember correctly, he was turned into to resemble Jesus. And so he was the one captured and crucified instead, while the other Jesus basically escaped and ascended directly to heaven without being crucified.
Right.
Which also, that's kind of similar to Apollonius of Tyana. He ascended to heaven and he did not, there was no crucifixion, and his body never made it to the tomb, so the tomb was empty. Jesus
was supposed to, in fulfillment of prophecy, be hung on a tree, right? And that effect means the cross. Even in the Gospels, how does Judas die? He hangs himself on a tree, right? His guts spill out, according to one Gospel, right? And it's also similar, if I can just interject real quick, to Odin hanging himself on the Yggdrasil world tree in Norway. And Tacitus, he knew about Norway. He went over there and made a bunch of
unification between Roman and Norse gods.
Right. Well, by the 2nd century, the Romans were well aware of German and British, Druidic, both Druidic and German religion. Unfortunately, they're not very good sources for us sometimes of those religions, but you're absolutely right. They would know about Northern European religion by this point, as well as Middle Eastern religion, and the Romans would be well aware of the political implications of those religions because there was very little separation between religion and politics at the time. So the Romans would have important interest in important intelligence would come back on that matter. And as the Roman Empire developed, of course, they were looking for ways of not only was international conquest and trade bringing religion, the Roman Empire itself infusing different nations and cultures. They, as time went on, were looking for a way to culturally unite their various people.
Yes, especially the conquered people.
Exactly. And so finding links between all these, in our book, we have one statue that's really a 1st century AD Roman statue that has images of the sun god and all kinds of deities, wings and, halos and the various, bow and arrow, various attributes of all these different deities in one statue for one deity. So to say that at this moment in history, when the Gospels are, for example, being created, say, as the earliest, say, the mid to late 1st century, Romans are already, up to their shoulders in trying to fuse every god in their world together into one.
Oh, yeah.
And so when we see that fusion in the Gospels, it's hardly surprising. Jesus is the light of the world, he calls himself. And he's resurrected, literally the title of the sun god, right? The light of the world. And he's resurrected at dawn in all 4 Gospels, just like the sun is resurrected at dawn. So he's a sun god. He's got attributes of many gods going on with Jesus. He's an echo of Serapis. But then you make your point. Scholars are starting to zero in on historical figures, Jewish rebels mostly, who themselves may have been the basis, the prototypical basis that was either reversed or used in the creation of the portraits of Jesus or his disciples in the Gospels.
And when I look at the story of Judas the Galilean, and I'm thinking to myself, okay, I don't think the Flavians would make the leader of the enemy of the Romans into the Son of God and into a pacifist. And I was like, obviously there's a pacifistic Jesus throughout the majority of the New Testament. And Luke's Jesus is a rebel like Judas the Galilean, fighting back against taxation. It's very similar to what Josephus was talking about. And like, okay, he's obviously Luke's Jesus, obviously. He's also Judas Iscariot because his son Menahem ben Judah is the leader of the Sicarii, which was a faction of the Canaan. The Canaan are the fourth sector, also known as the Zealots. But Canaan is the
to give context to this. The one of our main sources of this, well, our 2 main sources on the religious divisions in the 1st century are Philo and Josephus. Josephus takes the whole rebel movement and turns it into a 4th philosophy. These 3 main sects of Judaism: the Sadducees, the Pharisees, the Essenes. But he says there's this whole 4th philosophy that's founded by this Judas the Galilean early in the 1st century as a result of the first Roman census, the first attempt to bring a Roman taxation to the Holy Land. And so Judas the Galilean is a rebel, so he's a militant. He's the opposite of a pacifist, as we're told Jesus is in the Gospels. And he's fighting taxes. He's saying, don't pay your taxes to Rome. The very opposite of Jesus saying, render unto Caesar, or making a tax collector a disciple.
Yeah, that's the Gospel of Mark.
Exactly. Yeah. So the Jesus of the Gospels, who's a pacifist and pro-paying taxes and befriends tax collectors, Roman tax collectors, and says, go the extra mile for Romans, is sort of the opposite in his philosophy of Judas the Galilean.
And
we're told is the father of this 4th philosophy, which is what the historians tell us is the whole rebel ideology.
And it makes sense to me too, because he did start it. He initiated the chain of events that would cause it anyway, so he might as well be. So
that's what I was going to say. Like, I'm hearing so much from so many different views. And it's just something to throw up there. I haven't heard much spoken of by Dr. Carrier on this subject in terms of having any of the Dead Sea Scrolls seen on the map. And I don't, and I think he might just discard it because he doesn't consider their dating to be even relevant to the first century. But from what I've heard from like the Eisenman position and those who are on that side, there's some relevant, there's a relevant pattern here. And I told Luther, I said, Luther, what if the dating, let's just play a game and speculate and say, you know what, the dating is older. Let's just say some of these are 2nd century BC. Let's play that game.
Right.
How do we know that the philosophy of the Maccabean revolt is not continuity down through to the 1st century? And they're using the same motif that they used for Antiochus Epiphanes and these, if you will, these Roman type Greco-Roman pagans right down here to the 1st century. They're using the same motif. What's wrong with that?
Exactly. What is the main Jewish literature, for example, that we hear echoed in the New Testament? We hear, of course, all the Hebrew scriptures from Genesis through the prophets echoed over and over and over in the New Testament, which is a curious thing itself in the Gospels, because if you're writing a biography of a guy who lived in that same century, a recent biography, why would you be citing centuries-old Hebrew scripture for descriptions and facts and details about that life?
There's something wrong. There's something wrong there.
Something wrong there for sure. But aren't books like Daniel and the Maccabees and Jubilees and this very era's Jewish literature, just the language and the spirit is all over the New Testament, isn't it? And so when we look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, in my mind, it doesn't really matter whether they are written in the 1st century BC, 2nd century BC, or 1st century AD.
Totally agreed. Yep.
Because what it's reflecting is a nationalist ideology of Messianic Jews, purist Messianic Jews, and they believe that the Messiah is coming. They really believe in these Messianic prophecies. They're Jewish they're Jewish nationalists. They're Torah Orthodox. They're exclusionary of foreigners. If there's any bleed over in the ideology, if that ideology lasted for a century or two, then it surely is echoed in the philosophy of the Jewish rebels themselves. They're purists, nationalists, militants, and above all, believe in messianic prophecies, just like the sectarians, the sectarian documents that the Dead Sea Scrolls do. To give Eisenman also his due, his argument, and others join him in this argument, makes a lot more sense. Why would sectarian documents have been preserved? We know when they were put in those caves, it was during the First Jewish War around 70, 71 AD, right? Why would they be put in those caves by the Jewish rebels and preserved so carefully by Jewish rebels if there's some funky sectarian group who lived 2 centuries ago? So, so even if they were written earlier, these documents were important to the Jewish rebels, weren't they? Were important enough to preserve.
You bring a really good point up. What would be their relevance by that time? Like, what would be, you can argue all day how old the, what you're saying, the papyrus or this and that. But you have to ask yourself the question, is there any relevance contemporaneous to them at that time? Or are these just sacred old scriptures? They're still living according to the practices of this text. Whether or not this has traditionally been passed down since the Maccabeans or not, or even somewhere around that time, that doesn't, they're living according to that text. To me, it would mean that the evil one would have contemporary, or the liar would have a contemporary meaning, even if they said, hey, let's pass down the meaning of this liar.
That's a very good point.
It was obviously it was like a sacred religious history that had to be preserved in an area where the Romans wouldn't think of looking, or even if they did look, they wouldn't find it because it's neatly hidden in that area.
It worked, didn't it? We only found them in the middle of the 20th century. So for the better part of 2,000 years, that hiding worked, didn't it? And so you got to hats off to the Jewish rebels. They preserved a lot of their documents in the process of doing it just like that. And why would they preserve documents that didn't mean anything to them? The other thing we know too is that the material that documents are written on in those days, vellum, sheepskin, was recycled. And the carbon-14 dating can only tell us how old the beast is, right? It can only tell us how old that sheepskin is. It can't tell us whether that was bleached over and used again at a later date. So the carbon-14, as Professor Eisenman correctly points out, the carbon-14 gives us the earliest date for the document, doesn't give us the latest date for the document at all. And good, careful scientists are aware of that. And as we know, the actual date of the deposit, the eve of the Jewish War, around 70, 71 AD, or the end of the Jewish War, if you will, 70, 71 AD, then we have a definite time frame from which they could be, but it really any time in that period makes logical sense. And so while I can't say for certain that Eisenman's dating is correct, it makes good temporal logical sense. And at the end of the day, it doesn't much matter because those documents appear to have been important to the Jewish rebels and at least reflective of the same pro-Messiah, expecting militant nationalism that the rebels themselves embodied.
Yep. One way or another.
Right.
Yep.
You see, Paul in Romans 13 makes it clear that he is stating that the existing government of the time, the Roman government, are the appointed agents of God. This is
just like what Josephus is saying.
Exactly what Josephus, and the exact opposite of what the Jewish rebels would have said, whether the Dead Sea Scrolls are their documents or not. The other part of Eisenman's argument is correct. Paul is turning the language of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but even more than that, the whole ideology of the Dead Sea Scrolls on its head. And so whether or not Paul is the liar in the sectarian documents,
makes sense,
which he may well be, Paul is still taking the language and still taking the ideas of the Jewish rebels and inverting them into a pro-Roman pacifistic philosophy.
And looking for the his pacifistic version of Jesus. Because I was like, because it brings me to
back to Judas the Galilean, yeah.
It also brings me back to Adiabene, the kingdom of Adiabene, because I talked about in my previous videos that, and on previous interviews that when I look at the Greek, so his name is Isus. I'm like, there's only one person I can think of in the first century that sounds anything like that, and that was Bazus. And I find it curious that he dies in AD 31. I'm like, that's...
Now take us through that, Jacob. Take us through your argument, because that's not maybe widely understood. Take us through the steps of your, because that I found fascinating, the steps of your argument that show Bazius is actually died about the same time as Jesus. And you have a good argument for that. Can you explain that in some detail? Take us through that.
Yes. Josephus says that his son, Isates II, lived 55 years and ruled the kingdom for 24 years. Now, he basically starting at the beginning of the very first year of the first century and going and counting upwards. So if we do 55 AD,
so how do we do that? How the whole idea of BC and AD was centuries later. Well, yes. How do we know Josephus is working from the first century forward, basically?
Because he centered everything, most of what he talked about in first century context. He was always starting at the very beginning and trying
kind of like Judas the beginning of Judas the Galilean's revolt. That's where things begin for Josephus. And we can locate that around 6 or 7 AD, right? When the time of the first Roman census was.
Yes, that's it. So 55 AD. And then if we do 24 years minus 55, okay? You get 31 AD, because if you do 20 minus 55, you get 35. And 35 minus 4, 31.
Right.
Curious that even some church fathers, such as Maximus the Confessor and Eusebius, also say Jesus died in AD 31.
Right.
I'm like, that's obviously the dating for King Bazus. And what about the other one, though? Because other church fathers say, well, it's AD 33. I realized we're not talking about the same person. And so we're dealing with two people here, obviously. Judas the Galilean and King Bazus, whom we get the name Jesus from. So
now Jesus is the Greek version of Yeshua, right? That would be Jesus, the Greco-Roman version of what we call, where we get in English, Jesus, it sounds like Bazius, but would that sound like Yeshua?
Well, I remember I sent you a text
Uh-huh.
showing an etymological comparison that I did. So you got Yeshua, then you have Yeshu, then Jesus in Greek, then Bazus,
Uh-huh.
then Isus, then Isus, then Jesus. So yeah, Yeshua actually did become Bazus. In fact, in Hebrew, his name would have been Yeshua instead of Bazus because of that.
Fascinating.
Yeah, and it makes sense because Bazus would be Yahweh saves, but his name also sounds like, oddly enough, as like Zeus, and
Right.
and that's how I realized, okay, so that's how Yeshua became Isus. And like, yeah, I had a problem with that. People saying, oh, Yeshua just suddenly became Isus. I'm like, they don't sound alike. I don't understand how.
Right.
But with this etymology that I
Yeah, these steps need to be
on.
just explain. All you need to do is explain these steps, and then suddenly we have Bazus, who's sort of executed at about the same time as Jesus, at least, and now
No, he wasn't even executed. He just died.
Oh, you're right, exactly, or died. Excuse me, at the time.
No,
right.
it's all good.
Right,
and that's
not
really
crucified.
how it narrows it.
Right, not crucified.
Right,
yeah.
And that's what's important. And that's how we narrow it down, because originally, no reports of Bazus' crucifixion.
Right.
So is that Judas the Galilean was crucified, or was Jesus? Which one was?
Well, a pro-tax pacifist would not have been crucified by the Romans, eh? He might have been stoned by the Hebrews, but he would never have been crucified by the Romans. No, and Judas the Galilean, who began his activities in around 7 AD, he might well have been executed around 30, 31 AD, though. That might make sense, right?
Well, yeah, yes. And we look at the Gnostic text, he says he was crucified. And we can see why the New Testament and the Gnostic text disagree with each other, because it starts around with Josephus.
And as I say, even the Gospels tell us that Judas the Sicarii, or Judas Iscariot, was hung on a tree, hanged himself on a tree, in fascinating parallel, at about the same time that Jesus died too. Yeah. Even the Gospels say, right, Judas, the betrayer of Jesus, died at the same time as Jesus.
Yeah, and he basically died after the Romans take him, after the Romans take Jesus. Which to me, I think implies that Judas died after Jesus died, but not too far along.
Right, about the same time per the Gospels. Right. And if we believe the Gnostic Gospels, who treat Judas as an entirely different way in some of the Gnostic Gospels.
Oh yeah, they think he's a savior.
Yeah, he's a savior and a hero in certain Gnostic Gospels, at least. And when we see the death of Jesus together in the Gospels, being juxtaposed in opposite ways in the Gospels, Judas the betrayer of Jesus versus Jesus' crucifixion, which are both featured in our canonical Gospels, but are in effect hangings on trees in fulfillment of prophecy.
Right.
So Judas's own followers might have seen him in a messianic way. Judas. Oh yeah. Right.
And that bled over to Gnosticism.
Mm-hmm. And that might suggest that our Jesus in the Gospels is really this pacifist counter to the historical Judas the Galilean, the founder of the Jewish rebellion.
And it would easily be Bazus, because he represents exactly that.
Right.
His ancestors, they were pro-Roman elements in his ancestry, and this is the perfect counterpart for the pacifistic Jesus.
Right. What was Bazus' background and ancestry, and where was he king again?
He was king of Adiabene, and he's a grandson of Ptolemy Barmanius, whom was killed in about 40 BC when the Parthians attacked Judea. So you can see the family obviously relocated to Adiabene.
So these are Roman client kings.
Essentially, yes. And until, but that kind of
like the Herods.
Issue, yes. But that became an issue when General Pompey, had a little war with Ptolemy Barmanius in 49. I think it was 49 BC.
Yeah, in the middle of the first century BC, Ptolemy was really the first Roman general to march his way through the Holy Land, and exactly, he sort of set up the first Roman operations there in the Holy Land. But that was the middle of the first century BC, right?
Yeah, and the thing about that is, one way or another, this family, despite this, still did not. Obviously, they were not against Rome. They didn't take any actions against Rome anyway.
Right.
They weren't out for revenge, vengeance, or what have you. Now, and that's what I realized. This family, even though Pompey did what he did, was adamantly still loyal to Rome. So Rome either neutral, either loyal or neutral, depending on the circumstances.
Right. Huh. Right. Right. Fascinating. Fascinating.
So you said something interesting, James, in that you brought up Herod, and I think there's something going on with all that. Looking at people like Herod, for example, I had a gentleman propose to me. There's always propositions being thrown my way, and I guess a lot of people misunderstand the show. The show is pretty much a representation of freedom. Myth Vision, was attached to a group that we had called Freedom. What was it called? Free Thinkers Only is what I originally had it, and then I changed it to Freedom from Religion. But it was ultimately, we were originally called the Water Boys because we like the philosophy of Bruce Lee: be like water. If you get into a cup, you are the cup. Well, that's what we do with our guest, and a lot of people don't understand our philosophy. Myth Vision is not trying to be right about everything, because honestly, as soon as you think you're right, I cannot tell you how many times I've been let down. Okay, and then I hold on to a position for years that I think's right. I'm dogmatic about it, and then another proposition equally on the same par, intelligent, has as much equal evidence to propose it. Which one am I going to choose at this point? So I never take a dogmatic stance. And this guy says Herod may have been the father of Jesus, and that they incorporated some story into this. I don't know. There's always something, right? And I wonder if this connection to the Ptolemies that he is making here has somewhat of more of a positive influence on the authors of the New Testament versus someone like Herod, who had a negative, or Herod the Great.
The philosophical influence of Alexandrian Jews on Christianity is Alexandria was the capital of Ptolemaic Egypt. It was the city, it was the city of the Ptolemies. It was where the Temple of Serapis was built by Ptolemy I, and it was named after Alexander the Great. Alexandria on the delta of the Nile in Egypt became the center of Greek learning following the conquest of Alexander the Great, because many Greek scholars actually, like Euclid, the father of geometry, and many other Greek scholars came to work in Alexandria. So there were Greeks and Egyptians working in Alexandria, but there was also a large Jewish population in Alexandria, and by the 1st century this included the famous Platonic Jewish philosopher Philo of Alexandria, whose allegorical philosophy had a profound influence on Christianity, and the echoes of it can be seen particularly in the Gospel of John, but throughout both Neoplatonic and early Christian work. Philo of Alexandria was, of course, a 1st century Jewish philosopher working in Alexandria, the uncle of Tiberius Alexander, who was a general and governor who worked for the Flavians, and that family was married into the Herodian family. The Herodian family were also married into, you're going to love this, Jacob, the Ptolemaic family, being marrying into the descendants of Cleopatra and Mark Antony. So both the Ptolemaic family, the Herodian family, and the family of Philo of Alexandria, the Platonic Jewish philosopher, all come together in marriage in the 1st century AD.
And I do love that. And what I find even another thing that I find interesting is that the Ptolemies they had someone called Bermans.
Mm-hmm.
The Flavians did too.
That's right, a name shared by Herodian princesses and Ptolemaic princesses.
Sounds like a bloodline connections going on here.
They were, we know, Josephus reports that they were the Herodian family and the family of Cleopatra intermarried and had descendants, so that there would be people in the late 1st century and 2nd century who could claim descent from both the Ptolemies and the Herods.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, we know that Herod Agrippa II and Berenice themselves could claim through their father and their great-grandparents descent from both the Hasmonean royals, genuine Jewish priests and high priests and kings, and the Herodians, who were kind of Roman puppet kings that were thrust on them by the Romans.
And this takes me back to the bloodline connection between the Ptolemy Menenius and King Bazus. How I figured that out is, if you go look at Josephus, he says that Helena is the sister wife of King Bazus. And Helena is the daughter of Izates, obviously referring to Izates the first. And that would make Bazus his son. Now, if we go to the Jewish text called the Bereshith Rabbah, it says that it talked about Izates and his brother Monobaz, or Monbaz, or Monobaz, depending on how it's pronounced.
Mobazius, right?
Yeah. They had circumcision. They're talking about circumcision, something like that, and they are called the sons of Ptolemy. Like, and you look at Menenius, and this is how Menenius sounds a little like Monobazus. Obviously, it's the same last name being pronounced differently. And like, yeah, they're obviously talking about Ptolemy Menenius here, because Menenius or Menenius became Monobaz, and the last name was pronounced differently from that point on.
So in places like Abiadine, what you're imagining is sort of a fusion of pagan and Jewish culture that would sort of naturally have something like Christianity emerge from it?
Well, if we look at James, because James, the brother of Jesus,
right?
And it's like, obviously this guy is a brother of Bazus, and what made me realize that is that the Jews, they had issues with this guy. This James wasn't a rebel leader, so quite clearly it's not the same man as James, son of Judas. Besides, he died later than James, son of Judas the Galilean.
Oh yeah, well, James, two of the sons of Judas the Galilean were executed in the reign of Claudius.
Simon and James.
Right,
Yeah.
they were executed in the 40s AD, and Menachem, who survived, would go on to probably be a Jewish rebel leader, right?
Yeah, he was a leader of the Sicarii, and the Sicarii became Iscariot. Yeah.
Right, and he's the survivor. And Judas himself was probably killed even before the reign of Claudius, which puts his execution or death at about the same time as Jesus, right?
Yeah.
But this was where we might actually disagree. Why are you convinced that James, the brother of Jesus, was anti-Roman or pro-Roman and anti-Torah?
Well, the issue is that in the Talmud, the Pharisees come up to James, brother of Jesus, and they're having a disagreement with him. Like, they're trying to tell him, no, your brother didn't die and rise again. Right. It's like, no, I'm sticking to it, and they kill him. And I'm like, and James in the works of Josephus was killed by Ananus ben Ananus, and this killing was not authorized by the Sanhedrin, so they had him outed from the high priest. It doesn't sound too much like a rebel leader.
But if the Jewish establishment had a problem with the guy who executed James, wouldn't it suggest Josephus, when he tells the story of the death of James, suggests that James was a widely popular leader.
Name, and a name too is a popular name too.
Right. So just James, who was executed, who calls himself the brother of the previously mentioned or aforementioned Christ, depending on how you want to translate it. So this James, the brother of Jesus, called the Christ, was beloved, and those who thought who were righteous thought his execution was unjust. The Roman governor was away, and this Ananus could execute James because they're sort of between Roman governors, right?
Right.
And Ananus gets in trouble for it. You're absolutely right. Which suggests that there was a popular, just as Josephus suggests, a popular reaction, a negative popular reaction to the execution of James.
Yeah, I think James probably had mixed feelings, and who knows, and maybe, and
do you think he could be identified with the James that Paul is arguing with in Galatians? Because if so, that James, the brother of Jesus, who is also called James, the brother of Jesus in Galatians,
Right.
right? That what James was pro-Torah.
Right.
Paul is arguing with James over Torah orthodoxy. And don't Torah orthodoxy and being an ideological leader, say, of the rebellion go together? Wouldn't James be a militant? And wouldn't that be another reason why Paul would be arguing with him, taking his Romans 13 stand versus the militancy of someone like Cephas or James?
One way or another, I think James, whether he was defending the resurrection story or not,
right.
when I think
See, that's
about
the
that,
dubious part, isn't it?
He was quite clearly not all the way in on the agenda of deifying his brother.
Right.
And he had problems with that. He didn't have the same
and he was Torah Orthodox, right?
As his brother. And this is it's not surprising to me because this is a Greco-Hasmonean.
Maybe Paul was the author of the anti-Torah message, not any historical Jesus at all. Most historians, many at least Christian historians, have identified pre-Paul Christians as being Torah Orthodox Jews, Torah observant Jews. And if that's true, then Jesus was a Torah Orthodox Jew, right? If there was a historical Jesus. So the portrait
that would be more like Luke's Jesus.
Right.
So Judas the Galilean.
So in other words, if Paul was having the argument that he was having with James and Cephas in Galatians over eating with Gentiles and the necessity of circumcision, had Jesus actually acted and spoken as the Gospels portray him as acting and speaking, first of all, there'd be no argument because they would have accepted what Paul was doing, right? There would have been no argument. And then all Paul would have had to have done is cite what Jesus had said or done. Hey, didn't Jesus say that it doesn't matter what you put into your mouth? That's not impure. What's impure is what comes out of your body. And that would shut down the whole argument about kosher diet or eating with Gentiles. That
would imply that the Gospels haven't been written yet.
Right. So if the Gospels are written to demonstrate Paul's side of the argument in Galatians, right, then that would suggest that people like James and Cephas are Torah Orthodox,
right,
conservative Messianic Jews who now have the profile of our rebels like Judas the Galilean.
Right.
So James may be an ideological leader of the rebels. Now, Jesus, it's often said, was taken out by the Sanhedrin and by Jewish leaders because he was a nationalistic threat and that the Romans might punish. Well, wouldn't James have put the Jewish leadership in a similar situation? In other words, Ananus the pro-Roman, in effect, Ananus got rid of the rebel leader James. He may have taken a hit for it and gotten in trouble for it from Jewish conservatives on the Sanhedrin, but he took advantage of at the moment when the governor was there to get rid of a rival to himself, a Jewish leader of the rebellion like James. According to Origen, a late 3rd century Christian writer, there's a section of Josephus where Josephus ascribes the Jewish war itself, which broke out in 66, to the popular indignation and reaction to the execution of James, the brother of Jesus. If the execution of James, the brother of Jesus, was so angered the Jewish population that it could be thought of as a cause of the Jewish war, then let me suggest that James was a rebel leader. He was an ideological rebel leader whose execution so irritated the rebels and the poor priests, as Josephus suggests, that it could be in the chain reaction that would lead to the outbreak of war just 4 years later. This would put James on the side of the militants. It's interesting that Josephus praises James, but he also praises John the Baptist, who was executed by Herod Antipas. Both are messianic, in effect, pro-Torah Jewish leaders who apparently appeared to be threats to the pro-Roman governments of the moment. So I would suggest, perhaps, that James, the brother of Jesus, was executed for being a rebel leader, just as John the Baptist was. I would also suggest that it's odd that Josephus should praise both of those guys.
This sounds a lot like this is talking about James, son of Alphaeus, whom is not the brother of Jesus. And he does die in 62 AD.
Mm-hmm. So is the story about James, the son of Alphaeus, the reality, or is that an overwrite of the historical execution of James that Josephus tells us about?
I suspect somebody merged a brother of Basil, that's what's eventually referred to as James.
Oh, that's interesting.
So
you're James. I see what you're saying. So James, the son of Alphaeus, is like the brother of Basius. That could be.
Yeah, that's. I suspect that it's the emergence of two different people. That's what I was trying to say.
I see.
It didn't quite come out.
No,
right,
and it makes sense because what we see a lot of are, of course, the use of second and third names.
And that would explain why there's a kind of a weird, somewhat contradicting story around James, because you got two personalities trying to fit together, kind of like trying to merge Luke's Jesus with Mark, John, and Matthew's Jesus.
Right. Just like Judas Iscariot is like a rebel leader, right?
Right.
Sicarii. So I would say that maybe James and John, the sons of thunder, that's kind of a militant name. And they're the ones who Jesus is correcting.
Absolutely.
The first shall be last and the last shall be first. So don't try to be a leader here on earth. So if they're the sons of thunder trying to be leaders here on earth, let me suggest that James and John are these brothers, sort of a symbolic term there anyway. Brothers, the sons, another symbolic term in the New Testament, are rebel leaders, sons of thunder who got Jesus of the Gospels all backwards about who's in first and who's going to come in last in the kingdom of heaven. And so like Judas or like Peter, these are rebel leaders being rewritten into the stories of the disciples in the Gospels.
Yeah.
Would you go with that?
I actually am going with that because I know that the pacifists, the other historical pacifists, were being given the attributes of the messianic leaders.
Right.
Quite clearly. Valliant was given the story of Judas and obviously his crucifixion. And it also brought me to what I was talking about in I think it was the third interview that I was doing with Derek. And I identified Yeshu ben Pandira with Judas the Galilean.
Which is really ominous for connections with Jesus.
Yeah, because he's very similar to Judas the Galilean. He does the same exact things that he does, the taxation protests, all of that. But the thing is, this guy is supposed to be the son of Mary and the Roman soldier Pandira.
Right.
And Joseph left Mary because she got the story goes, it was either adultery or rape, one of those two things. And the thing is, I look into Josephus, I look into the 1st century BC, and I noticed something that caught my attention. It was a story of Mariamne I and Herod the Great.
Right.
Like, why is nobody noticing that this is the exact same story? The Talmud is regurgitating what Josephus already talks about. Mariamne I, Herod the Great, when he was going down someplace because he was being charged with something that he got away from, Herod had Joseph sent to guard Mariamne I to make sure she didn't leave while he was away. I'm like, and then you got this woman called Salome going over, Salome, going over there and accusing them of having adultery. Herod gets mad and has both of them killed. I'm like, that's just like what happened with the Joseph and Pandira
isn't that
story.
Joseph related? And isn't that Joseph related to Herod?
Yeah, I think it was his uncle. I don't remember. I do know he's a
Herodian, right? So this Herodian named Joseph was set to guard a wife of Herod the Great's named Mary, in effect, and is accused of having adultery. So we have a Joseph and a Mary who are accused of having adultery and executed by Herod the Great.
Yeah.
And that story is echoed, you're saying, in the Talmud's ridiculing of the Jesus birth story. Because the Talmud is famous because when we read the Gospels, of course, they take the virgin birth seriously. If you read Matthew and Luke, it's clear that the Holy Spirit has come to Mary, and Jesus's divine ancestry, fatherhood, is sort of indicated by the virgin birth. And even if they have to play with the translation, it's the fulfillment of prophecy, according to Matthew, right? So what the Talmud is doing, obviously at a later state, is sort of ridiculing the tale of a virgin birth, because Jews, being monotheists, are denying the divinity of Jesus. So one of the principal things that the Talmud is setting out to do is ridicule the claims that Jesus is a god and was born of a virgin, as the son of a god. And so the story they take from Celsus, right, that he was a Roman soldier who fathered Jesus, and there wasn't a virgin birth at all, a Roman soldier, which kind of makes it, tells you the genealogy, what the Jews are saying in their first reference to Jesus, that it comes from the Romans. And in so doing, they're creating this story, which does echo a story from something they don't really like, the Herods, right? And the bad sexual behavior, the naughty sexual behavior of the Herods is finding an echo.
They tend to identify with Pandora with
Pandera, right?
They with a tombstone in Bad Kreuznach in Germany, Bingerbach, Germany, of Tiberius Julius Abdus Pandora.
Right.
I don't think that's him, because
finding a Roman soldier with the cognomen Pandera is not getting us anywhere near to saying he's the actual father of Jesus, is it? No, in fact, what they're doing is finding a name that was used. Just like Jesus was a commonly used name. It doesn't help us much, right?
The Talmud, Pandora is the equivalent of the Herodian Joseph that had intercourse with Mariamne, Mary, and Herod, and the Talmudic Joseph wants nothing to do with it.
Right,
like,
right.
You screwed me over.
Right.
And the thing is, it looks like that Judas the Galilean was obviously attributed to them as his parents in the Talmud version of events.
That's very interesting. That's very, very interesting. I have to say, there is little doubt in my mind that the later Herodians, right, are being positively featured in like the book of Acts, right? Herod Agrippa II and his sister positively appear in the book of Acts to help out Paul even, right? And just as Roman governors appear to be helping Paul throughout the book of Acts, and just as Paul in his own letter to the Philippians seems to be very friendly with high-ranking Romans, there appears to be a Herodian connection with the mission of Paul, at least as explained in the book of Acts. And Paul's basic pro-Roman stance, as revealed in Romans 13, is identical, in effect, to the same stance Josephus, the Flavian propagandist, is taking. When Josephus tells the story of going over to the Romans, he says, I'm still a good Jew, but the Jewish God has gone over to the Roman side, so please, God, help me as I go minister to the Romans now to tell them that they're your agents, in effect, right?
Yeah.
But I think that what's happening with the disciples and with James and Cephas and stuff are the reworking, at least in part, of some rebel leaders, some anti-Roman rebel leaders.
Absolutely.
Who are like, I mean, for example, Judas Iscariot is Judas the Galilean, right?
Right, and Luke's Jesus. So
and
the brothers,
maybe Jesus too. Maybe Jesus too.
And the well, not the pacifist one, obviously.
See, Undermeyer, I think, is really onto something here, isn't he? Judas the Galilean. I mean, it notes where it's happening, when it's happening. You'll note Luke is saying that the birth of Jesus happens with the same census that Josephus tells us started the rebellion movement of Judas the Galilean. In other words, Jesus was born at the same moment that the movement of Judas the Galilean was born, with that same census.
Right. Obviously they got it from that. And I think the pacifistic Jesus, the one that's telling everybody to side with Rome, was obviously Bassus, because he represents that. At the very least, Josephus used him as a catalyst, a chronological catalyst.
One of the models. One of the models.
Pacifistic Jesus.
Would you agree that the Jesus of the Gospels that we have is, well, like a Frankenstein's monster, stitched together from different pieces of people from history and myth?
I agree.
So that we can have multiple figures, sort of like an X-ray mirror opposite version of Judas the Galilean being featured in Jesus. So instead of Judas the Galilean being executed under Pilate, which makes much more sense, right? It's Jesus, this pacifist, pro-tax, pro-Roman guy who's being wrongly executed at the same basic time as Judas the Galilean might have been, or Basius might have been. So that more than one historical figure might be being blended into the character of Jesus as we get him in the New Testament.
And that synchronism of the two can cause the brothers to be synchronized and the children to be synchronized as well together, and cause multiple personalities to be blended together. Because then you got James, brother of Jesus, then you have James, the son of Judas, and then this James and that James being identified as the same person. That one example right there.
Well, the names can get just absolutely crazy. We've got Saul who becomes Paul. We've got Simon who becomes Peter. We've got Thomas the twin, who's also called the twin. We've got James, who's the brother of Jesus, but we've got James, who's the brother of John, and they're the sons of thunder. And being brother is a Christian title, and being son of the man or son of man is also a title for Jesus. So son of and brother of are as much titles as anything else. People are being given second names, like rebels might be, or people involved in a secret organization might be, or people who have experienced a rebirth to a new life might be. So we're never quite sure, who are we talking about? Barnabas was later to be called Joseph, we're told, and so-and-so is to be called later as this person. So why are everyone's got a second name? Everyone's got a code name in the New Testament. And so it leads to confusion. So when they say, oh, when we mean this James, don't be confused. James, the son of Alphaeus, is not James, the brother of John. And don't be confused that this Jude is Judas Iscariot, who betrayed Jesus, and this Simon here is Simon the Canaanite, or the Zealot, not Simon, who's called Peter, because we're recycling the same names over and over in the New Testament. They have to make these distinctions. You almost get the impression that either they're turning one person into two, right? Or they're having to take two people who have similar names and distinguish them for some important reason, even though they're bringing them together.
Right.
So names in general are a slippery thing in the New Testament. Which Simon, which Jude, which James, which John, which Joseph? Joseph is the one who sort of brings Jesus into the world, and Joseph is the one who buries him. Two different Josephs, right? And yet the Joseph who sort of brings Jesus into the world is an echo of the Joseph of Genesis. Joseph in Genesis in Egypt interprets prophetic dreams for a foreign emperor, and Joseph is led to Egypt it takes Jesus and Mary to Egypt to save him from the slaughter of the babies because of his prophetic dreams. So Joseph with prophetic dreams, Egypt. Joseph with prophetic dreams, Egypt. Matthew's nativity story is an echo of the Genesis story of Joseph. Just as the slaughter of the babies in Matthew's nativity story echoes the slaughter of the babies that happens at the time of Moses' birth, that puts Moses in the basket on the river. So the Old Testament is being written in what the Christians call the Old Testament is being written in detailed description, in linguistic detailed description into the New Testament in various ways. As I say, which is itself a very curious thing. But the names themselves are also sometimes echoes of Old Testament names like Joseph. And then when we hear names recycled or being used in a double way, Thomas, the twin. The twin. What? Are these people the same? Are they different? Are we told that there's somehow a splitting or a twinning? Simon Peter versus Simon Magus in the pseudo-calamity. Which Simon? Simon the Zealot, the Canaanite, or Simon who's called Peter? Jude this one, or Jude Iscariot who betrayed Jesus? Name, it's almost as though we're being told that there's a double identity and a reversal of identities that's going on with disciple names or character names.
Right. And that that's one of the finest examples of the syncretism of these different families together in the New Testament, is what brought it all together.
What I liked is
And
Luther is actually currently doing something interesting with the historical. See, like, this is a little complex, but if you look at the historical nature of the first century, whoever wrote these histories that we know of, or I would almost say whoever wrote these gospel narratives, if you will, they knew the history well. And they didn't just know history, they understood how to understood how to Paul Bunyan and the Blue Ox the situation. And they took an angle at which they, in my opinion, they mythologized a history because to them, where I'm looking at this, is the temple and everything that happened, even on the pagan side, as much as we look at it on the Jewish side and go, that's so religious. And so, no, even on the pagan side, they saw this as so majestic and such a cataclysmic event that I think they attribute it to the end of the age. They are saying the gods are divinely into it, so they took, I would say, their greatest religious or spiritual philosophies and astrologies and all this and incorporated it into a text that has been so mythologized, in my opinion, that I'm not saying there isn't historical. It's just you can't know with a matter of fact at this point, in my opinion.
Right,
you
right.
can only speculate.
Well, as you said in the beginning, when we're talking especially about this subject, we have to really be hypothesizing and theorizing. We're talking about 2,000-year-old documents. We're talking about fragmentary sources. We're talking about centuries and centuries ago. So we're doing the best we can. You know, some great archaeologists once described the process of archaeology as going through a couple of waste paper baskets to figure out what the office did. And that's basically what an archaeologist is doing. He's going through a couple of waste paper baskets and trying to reconstruct everything that went on in the office from a couple of waste paper baskets. And that's really what archaeology basically is doing, fragmentary ancient evidence. And we're doing our, level best to figure this stuff out. But let's face it, it's difficult to figure stuff out. I want to also echo what you said, I think very, very importantly. This was an age in which politics and religion were not separated. The coming of the Roman Empire, well, first of all, the Romans regarded their republic, which had existed for 500 years earlier, as a sacred thing. They didn't do anything political. The Senate didn't meet. They didn't have elections. They didn't do anything without invoking, they certainly didn't go to war without invoking the augurs and asking the priests whether the gods could be asked for help, whether we could expect a good result from the prophets and the oracles. And nothing happened that did not have religious significance and religious ceremony that went with it. And the Romans regarded their own republic as a sacred institution, protected by the gods. When the Roman Republic came to an end and the empire took over, Augustus is the first emperor, and he has changed the constitution, if you will, of the way the Roman Empire works. It's no longer a republic, but a monarchy in which one man basically has nearly all the power, and the Senate is largely and increasingly over time merely symbolic in terms of its power. Augustus brought about for the first time in Roman history, the first imperial cult. He named his adopted father, his great uncle Julius, the first Roman god, the first Roman to be declared a god after his death since the founding of Rome, Romulus. And the arrival of the imperial cult, Augustus himself, the first emperor, would be itself, he himself would become a god and the object of religious veneration, as would popular emperors thereafter. Not all of them, but the popular good emperors were thought of as divinities. And this radical change in the first century BC and the first century AD, this coming of the Roman Empire, was thought of as a cataclysmic, apocalyptic event, a religious event, if you will. World rule has been brought, the world that they knew, at least, and the Romans thought of it as ruling the world, literally, and as themselves as having brought order to the entire world. That could only have had religious significance to them. The gods have favored the Romans. The Roman leaders are favored by gods. And even Jewish leaders like Josephus, could say the God, our God, the one true God, Yahweh, the God of the Jews, has gone over to the Roman side. In the middle of the 1st century, you've got Josephus saying that. That is fascinating to me, that various religions, including Jewish leaders at the time, are recognizing that the 1st century AD is a time of religious importance because of the advent of the Roman Empire. The Jewish rebels themselves had similar apocalyptic views, as the Dead Sea Scrolls sort of indicate. They expect this cataclysmic, apocalyptic end of times war between the sons of light and the sons of darkness to be coming, and you better be ready for it because it's happening, and the Messiah will come to lead Israel to ultimate earthly political victory here on earth. So the politics of being pro-Roman or being a Jewish rebel are infused with religion. They look at it in a religious sense. God's on our side, we're going to win. God's given us the prophecies, we're going to win. The Tacitus and Josephus, both Jewish and pagan historians, say the Jewish war was primarily caused by the Jewish prophecies of the Messiah. In other words, they believed in the earthly hopes, the political, military hopes of their Messiah, and that was the principal cause for the Jewish wars of the 1st and 2nd centuries.
Right.
The Romans responded in an equally religious way in their political military response. We, the Flavians, are the messiahs of your prophecy. You got it wrong.
Right. Yep.
In effect, the Gospels are proving that they got it wrong.
Yeah. And that right there is what sealed the deal. And what the Flavians did was they pretty much did the same thing that Ptolemy the First Soter did when he became Pharaoh of Egypt. They
even used his god Serapis.
Made Serapis the supreme national god.
You can see coins of Vespasian or Titus, Roman minted coins in the late 1st century, with the image of the Roman emperors Vespasian or Titus on one side, and the Ptolemaic syncretistic god Serapis, invented by Ptolemy the First, on the other. That's how influential the Ptolemies and Serapis were as a precedent for the Flavians.
And
they claim to be both, interestingly, Jewish messiahs and the new Serapis.
Yeah, and then you had this messianic followers of Christus and Suetonius that are countering this movement, because they also try to synchronize Yahweh with Serapis. And it looked like this is a group that is rejecting that synchronism, isn't buying into it, because they rebel because they also don't want to put the emperor statue in their temples and worship him.
That's the essence. Since the Maccabean revolt, right, in the 200s BC, right, in the 2nd century BC, the Maccabeans revolted against the Syrian Greeks, the Seleucids, who have conquered and defiled Jerusalem as far as they're concerned, and defiled the temple and brought desecration to the temple with their pagan polytheistic ways. Jewish monotheism was itself a highly sectarian thing. Our God and only our God. And that requires political independence as far as they're concerned in order to execute and properly, faithfully live the Mosaic law. So there's a close connection between Jewish nationalism and Torah orthodoxy, and keeping out Greco-Roman influence. The keeping out of Greek influence was what motivated the Hanukkah rebellion of the Maccabees in the 2nd century BC. And we can see it was the same basic motivation for the Jewish rebels of the 1st and 2nd centuries AD.
Right.
Same ideology.
I got a question for you, James. The Hanukkah rebellion, does the beginning of Revelation, the book of Revelation, is there any significance to that that allegory? There's 7 stars and the 7 candlesticks and stuff. Is that Hanukkah related? Is there something connected to the Maccabean there in the book of Revelation?
Numbers. I suspect that when we're given numbers in the New Testament, there is a serious significance to it. Sometimes the significance is unknown to us fully. Other times the significance is multiple significance. We were just, one of the things Jacob and I were talking about is, say, the number 12. And you can do this with the number 3 as well. How many days was Jonas in the belly of the whale? 3. But in pagan mythology, were there triple gods? Were there triple goddesses? Ate with the three faces, the three graces, the three furies, the three fates that are also powerful. There are the forms of the triple goddess. Were there Egyptian gods in triple form? Yes, there sure were. So when we're talking about trinities, trinities long predate Christian Trinity. And there are pagan triple goddesses and certainly at least one pagan Egyptian triple god. But then there are also Hebrew 3-day importances. The sign of Jonah, for example. 3 days has repeated significance. If we talk about 12, 12 has incredible significance. There's a college of 12 priests in Egypt. There's the 12 Olympian gods in Greece. And the 12 zodiac signs of the Magi, which give us the modern 12 zodiac signs. So, but then again, the Dead Sea Scrolls talk about a leadership organization within the sectarians, which have leadership roles of groups of 3, 7, and 12. As if the numbers 3, 7, and 12 also have numeric significance for leadership organization. So, go, Jacob.
I remember I talked about that in my previous videos, the 12, and I was telling you about that 12 Olympian gods. To me, is very similar to the 12 apostles of Jesus. And the reason why I think that is because I don't necessarily think the 12 thing directly came from the zodiac, because the 12 apostles are already humanized. They're human. They're euhemerized. It's obviously a euhemerized version of the zodiac. But the Greeks already had that with the 12 apostles. 12 Olympian gods.
Right.
And you think about it, Orion was being synchronized with Serapis, and he was being synchronized with Zeus. Orion is the supreme god of a different version of the Olympian Council. And he walks on water. He ascends to the constellations, become constellation of Orion after he dies, like the resurrection of the dead, ascending to heaven.
Many pagan gods get put in the stars as constellations, right?
Right. He's also in his own way. He's also a sun deity, and
Orion, the bringer of water, right?
Yes, and the 3 stars in Orion's belt,
right?
The 3 wise men, the 3 days of death and resurrection too,
right? And Josephus spends 3 days in his cave before being discovered by a woman and being resurrected to a new life among the Romans. So these 3 echoes are serving multiple purposes, let me suggest. And the 12 echoes, Jesus, if there was a Jesus, he surely had 13, 14, 20, 50 followers. You'd hate to be follower number 13 or 14 because you're not getting into the 12. So the whole thing about the 12 is that it is of symbolic importance. There is a 12. Just like there is a 3, right? And later on, there'll be 7 deacons. So 3, 7, and 12 are of significance for other religious purposes and multiple religious purposes, let me suggest. The 12 reflect both Jewish organizational leadership roles already, but also are familiar to the pagans as the 12 zodiac signs and the 12 Olympic deities.
And you look at if you look at like the trident of Poseidon, and sometimes they would depict Satan that way,
right?
Ripping it off from Poseidon. And Poseidon and Zeus, they had a rivalry, a very fierce rivalry. When we see the scorpion killing Orion, and some would compare Scorpio with Judas Iscariot in the kiss of death,
right? Because the mark that scorpions leave is kiss-like, notoriously, right?
Yeah.
All of that too, because Zeus is associated with a bull and Taurus.
The bull.
Right, exactly. And so there's all kinds of different connections. Gemini are twins, and Thomas is a twin, right?
Yeah.
So we have twins among the 12. So when you have enough connections, like one of the 12 are literally named twin, and one of the 12 horoscope signs are Gemini the twins.
And you look at Plato's dialogue to Timaeus.
Well, that has all kinds of Plato is being echoed in numerous ways, philosophically and perhaps even imagematically in the New Testament.
He talks about that.
The martyrdom of Socrates itself, the death of Socrates itself is sort of a martyrdom, a philosophical martyrdom that predates Jesus by 400 years.
Yeah. And I was going to bring up Phaethon.
Right.
Phaethon asked his father, Helios, can I drive your chariot, Daddy? He's like, okay. Briefly teaches his son how to do it. He goes in the sky, drives that chariot, loses control, son gets too close to the earth, starts setting it on fire, killing everybody. And then Zeus quickly strikes him down, trying to stop the apocalypse, solar apocalypse, as I would call it. And the interesting thing is Zeus was synchronized with Helios several times, especially with Serapis. So in effect, Helios as Zeus actually strikes down his own son to save humanity.
Well, that's a fascinating way of looking at it, because certainly by the time of Serapis, he's both a sun god and a Zeus god.
Absolutely.
So our Serapeans would see the Phaeton story as just the sense you're saying, father striking down son.
And the chariots of the sun chariot is pulled by 4 horses, 4-winged horses. And you see in the book of Revelation, there's 4 horsemen bringing about the apocalypse, and Jesus says, "Oh God the Father forsaken His Son to
it
save
is.
humanity."
Let me say this: the parallels, those who say that we are overdoing it with pagan parallels may have a point, in the sense that these numbers and images get to be so common that what are we talking about? The 4 corners of the earth, the 4 winds, because we know there's 4 winds, there's 4 corners of the earth, there's 4 horses that carry the chariot, the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. So what 4 are we talking about? Because in Revelation, a lot of the imagery is the 4 ends of the earth.
I think
right? Revelation has that imagery.
I think the Apocalypse and Revelation is a blending of Plato's dialogue of Timaeus and the Daniel's.
Definitely Daniel shows up in Revelation, right? Yeah. And Dead Sea Scrolls. Now that we're in possession of apocalyptic literature in the Dead Sea Scrolls community, we now see the echoes. Revelation is an echo of a whole older Jewish tradition of apocalyptic literature that starts, Daniel is just a classic example, and Revelation is just a later example.
Right. And the thing is, and I don't think we're overdoing it in the parallels, because when I realized the 4 horsemen story is very similar to the story of Helios and his son Phaethon, in Revelation, it relies on the death and resurrection of Jesus and the forsaking of Jesus for that apocalypse to happen. So you can easily see how they synchronize the 4 kingdoms of David with Greek mythology to make it work.
Right. The 4 corners of the earth, the 4 winds, the 4 kingdoms, the 4 horses. Right. Jesus. Oh, and 4 anchors are laid down in Paul's shipwreck, by the way, in Acts.
Well, yeah, there you go. Yeah.
And of course, 3 is so religiously significant. 3 times 4 is 12.
Right. And you get 12 apostles again.
Right, exactly.
It just keeps going back.
Right. No, so all those numbers, Derek, are significant. We don't always know the significance, and sometimes there's multiple significance. There's many forms of significance being layered in. But the 12 is an artificial thing. The 12. The 3 special disciples is an artificial thing. The 3.
12 tribes of Israel.
Right, the 12 tribes. Well, Jesus himself, at one point in the gospel, says that each of the disciples would be judges of each of the 12 tribes. So the 12 tribes are definitely connected to the 12 disciples by Jesus himself in the gospels.
Oh, yeah. I'm a big numerology guy, and then looking outside of the Bible, too. It started to expand my mind. Like, what really started to free me from the biblical account was finding the biblical account's narratives, numerology, like the numerical values, repetitive themes, and commonalities between it and other surrounding mythologies. And then you have to go, it's funny because when you're in the box, you have to try and rationalize those things once you see them. And then you got to go, and then someone just goes, just in a loving way, somehow they are like, now what's more likely? What's more likely? I mean, let's be real here. This is a literary story, or is this the literal one true story, and all the copycats somehow predated it.
Predated it by centuries. Had similar thing. Had a dozen similarities centuries earlier that were all just put together and echoed in this one.
You know what
sewn
I said,
together in this one, right?
And this was my answer. The devil did it. No, I'm just kidding with you.
The New Testament was inspired by the devil. Ooh, you're a heretic.
The devil tricked everybody. No, it started stretching my consciousness because I was like, hold up. So then I went to this position that all religions are teaching the truth, and like they're all right. But then you gotta throw away certain things for that to be the case. Like there's certain dogmatic stances each of them take, and they go, no. So then, where I'm at today is I do believe that they all hold very subjective truths in them, and there's wisdom teachings. There's things that are true today that will always be true that are written in these texts. And then there's some shit that I'm like, get rid of that shit right now. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Dude,
well,
what?
look, as old as thou shalt not kill and thou shalt not steal. Obviously, some basic moral truths have been part of morality for a long, long time. And part of what religion is trying to do is transmit philosophy in a time when people are not philosophical, and where a religious hook needs to be part of educating the young. Don't be bad or you'll get into trouble with this on the other side. And that motivated moral behavior and helped transmit ethical and philosophical knowledge. So you're absolutely right. And the literature is absolutely beautiful literature in many places too. So what's being conveyed are some of the best in allegorical and philosophical thinking, but also, no question, people are taking political sides as well. And we have to be mindful of the fact that everyone's got an agenda that is combined, that usually combines religion and politics in one.
Yeah, and the thing is, I'm not sure, I don't remember if I brought it up earlier, but I was trying to say that, oh yeah, I did bring it up earlier. I did. The syncretism between Zeus and King Bazus, the names sound alike, and the 12 apostles thing, and you can see that even in the New Testament, when it often used the name Hades as a name for hell.
Right. Fascinating right there.
Yeah.
Right. Doesn't Josephus do similar things? Even when he's speaking of the Jewish afterlife, he'll refer to Hades.
He wrote a dissertation on Hades, apparently.
Well, did he? Was that ascribed to William Whiston? William Whiston, the early translator, Josephus, thought that Josephus was the author of that.
Yeah,
but there are some works. There are some works that are dubious. Yeah, some things that were ascribed to Josephus that are probably of medieval origin. And his dissertation on Hades is a remarkable thing coming from the pen of a Jew.
Yeah, that's why I said apparently. I didn't say it really was written by him.
Right. If it is, if someone could prove that, no, but I doubt they could. So what's interesting is what a Christmas tree Josephus himself became. Because as we were saying, one of my own theories about Josephus is that his own autobiography echoes the Joseph of Genesis, just as the Joseph of Matthew echoes the Joseph of Genesis. So if Joseph in Genesis has prophetic dreams that takes the Holy Family to Egypt, Joseph, Flavius Josephus, has prophetic dreams that tell him that he interprets for a foreign emperor, just like the Joseph of the Genesis interprets prophetic dreams for a foreign emperor. So Joseph and prophetic dreams. Joseph.
You got me, okay, you got me messed up here, and it's only because I must admit, and I only say this because I'm just speculating once again, it's all I can do. I wonder if Josephus was never really a part of the enemy. If he was really never part of it, I wonder if he was born into royal household and somehow he was adopted into the Flavian household due to royalty. I wonder if this whole narrative is a mythologization or whatever of
I'll go with
from
that.
from the Jewish religion, and he is putting his religion to to the best of his ability on him.
Who the hell is Josephus? He's like Paul. He claims to be a Pharisee, but he's Torah critical, like Paul. He's against forced circumcision and kosher diet, rigidity, just like Paul. And he believes God has gone over to the side of the Romans, just like Paul. So Josephus shares an ideology with Paul about the Torah and about obeying the Romans. And also he shares a shipwreck with different numbers, but a curious shipwreck at about the same time that Paul does. And he claims to be a Pharisee, even though he's a critic of Torah. So there are all these odd parallels between Josephus and Paul. And I am, as I say, suspicious of the characters, the self-identification of both. Saul of Tarsus gets this new name Paul, and Josephus is just like the Joseph of at least an echo.
I actually don't think that the Saul that became Paul is Saul of Tarsus.
Go now. It's your turn, Jacob. Go.
Yeah, Josephus is supposed to be born in Jerusalem, apparently. By the way, before I continue, the work of the dissertation on Hades is now attributed to Hippolytus.
Right. Yeah,
that's the. Apparently, that is the real one, and that was just shoved into Josephus later. Yeah.
Very frequently, there are later writers, Hegesippus or Hippolytus, that are authors that are attributing stuff stuff is attributed to that they wrote to Josephus.
Right. Now, Saul of Tarsus looks a lot like to me that he's Apollonius of Tyana. I brought this in the second interview with Derek. I talked about Saul of Tarsus, the son of God.
You are going to burn. You are a heretic.
Yeah, he was seen as son of a god in a way in the life of Apollonius of Tyana.
Well, Paul, if there was a historical Paul, and Acts is giving us anything like the truth, he was interacting with certain governors whose names are named in Acts. He's interacting with Herod Agrippa II and Berenice. We hear that in the book of Acts. And if James, the brother of Jesus, who's executed in 62, and Cephas are people that Paul's arguing with in Galatians, then that puts a Paul who's working, in the 40s and 50s and maybe dead by the 60s. How could you say that Apollonius of Tyana, who would die in the 90s and was up to his main flourishing in the 70s and 80s during the Flavian period, are the same, two and the same people, and they appear to be generationally, although first century, they appear to be generationally separate figures?
Well, I'm not saying that he is Paul.
Okay.
I'm saying Saul of Tarsus. Saul that became Paul is somebody else.
Aha.
Saul of Tarsus is Apollonius of Tyana.
Aha.
They're both born in Turkey, and by the way, he was relocated by his father to Tarsus to be educated by a Phoenician teacher.
Okay.
And
that's fascinating.
And
so they're both from Asia, from that basic area of Tarsus. I see. And Apollonius of Tyana is, for people who are listening and may not know this, is a wandering healer and teacher of the late first century who later writers actually associate with the Flavians. But he is a very Jesus-like figure in many ways. He was taken up, he was a healer, he was a miracle worker, an itinerant teacher, and has, at least in tradition, although maybe not in history, a connection with the Flavians. And his life is basically told to us by a Flavius Philostratus at a much later time, another Flavian, though, interestingly, just in case people don't know who Apollonius of Tyana is.
Yeah, and I was pointing out the Lucius Flavius thing on that video I did a while back.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, why would the Flavians care enough to write about this guy down? And then and when you look at Apollonius of Tyana, he was taken and charged for entering Rome. He did something, and then Emperor Domitian, after working it out, had him released, which reminded me of the story of Jesus Barabbas, son of the Father.
Who was released. Because the Jesus who was released, right.
It was very similar. And like I said earlier, when he died, his body never made it to to the tomb and went straight to heaven, ascended to heaven.
Like Apollonius ascended.
Yeah, like Jesus, in his body, the empty tomb story. It's so radically similar.
Many scholars have noted parallels between Apollonius of Tyana and Jesus, and the traditional date for Apollonius of Tyana's life corresponds not with Jesus, but with actually the time at which the Gospels were written, the late 1st century as opposed to the early 1st century. But the parallels between Apollonius of Tyana and Jesus have been noted by numerous scholars at this point.
I think all the people we mentioned throughout this video have all influenced Jesus in some way. All of them.
See, Jesus is what you're saying is Jesus really is a Frankenstein's monster of pro and anti-Roman elements. Yeah,
because you can't identify him with one total person.
Well, we're given more than one Jesus, as you point out, Jesus Christ and Jesus Barabbas. There's more than one Jesus, even, just as there's more than one James or John or Simon, right? Joseph. There's always double. We're given, for some reason, we're given double names. There's always a second one of the same name who appears to be just the opposite or different, or don't confuse him with this one. For some reason, we're being told, no, it's not the one you're thinking of. And as you point out, people in the 1st century would have known these historical characters, just as we're aware of Barack Obama and Donald Trump. So they would be aware of major figures of history, both the Jewish rebellion and in Roman history, just as we are familiar with contemporary political and cultural figures.
Right.
Well, James and Jacob, I think we're running up on our time. You guys, give us the materials that you guys have to, let everyone who's watching be able to read more up on some of the stuff that you guys have done.
Wow, you first, Jacob.
Well, as I was trying to point out throughout the video, that I believe Christianity replaced Serapism. Jesus was used to replace Serapis, and Jesus inherited the miracles of Serapis, and that this celestial Jesus obviously is Serapis, and he's being euhemerized and historicized into 1st century context, given the attributes of real people that lived, to make it appear that this dude is real, died and rose again. Because back then, people thought differently than we do now. I'm like, okay, Pontius Pilate existed, the man that crucified him. Why are we going to be down his resurrection story? They often associate one thing with the other when they shouldn't have, and that Zeus's 12 Olympians is similar to 12 euhemerized apostles of Jesus, and that Orion, Sahu, which is Orion, Serapis, and Zeus Syncretism made this Orion figure, who was also identified with Sol Invictus and Bacchus and Dionysus, the supreme god of a different kind of Olympian council, which would go well with the story of Jesus. And that they merged the accounts of Judas the Galilean and Bazus together. Is trying to blend. These are the two. I think it's obvious they focused on these two the most out of all the other people. They focused on these two guys the most. The pacifist Bazus and Judas the Galilean, the other Jesus, of Luke's Jesus, and Judas, whom is also Judas Iscariot. They're trying to blend these two together. One is not a pacifist, one is against Rome, the other is a pacifist and is not against Rome. And it really shows how Luke's Jesus is not really compatible with that of the other Jesus that's in the other 3 Gospels, Mark, Matthew, and John. And that the New Testament is a redacted version, ripoff of Josephus's works, added material written by other people later on, such as Revelation being given the material of Plato, and the Daniel's prophecy of the 4 kingdoms.
Wow. So we really have to wait for your work to be completed before we get the full story, don't we, Jacob? I am dying to read it. It sounds fascinating. In general terms, I totally agree with your perspective on things. Jesus is a composite. He's a composite of rebel leaders and pro-Roman elements, and of course, previous pagans. For people who want to read about this, we mentioned Untermeyer's work. That's really key, because Judas the Galilean is, I think, a precedent for Jesus. It may be not as complete as he says, but it certainly is. When it comes to the Dead Sea Scrolls, Professor Robert Eisenman is still my go-to guy. I think he's got that down pat, and even where I may disagree with him. When it comes to pagan sources for Christianity, there are many scholars. Dr. Robert Price, who you guys at Myth Vision have interviewed many times, is probably the outstanding guy in terms of his work in pointing out pagan precedent. I would, in all modesty, point out Creating Christ, where we stress the role of the Ptolemaic syncretistic god Serapis and his role in the precedent toward Christianity. So I think there are a lot of good sources that are getting us there, and I think all of us, including Jacob, are helping move us further and further along the line to understanding how both pagan and Jewish figures from the first century and pagan religious figures from centuries earlier are being blended together to create the Jesus of the Gospels. I think that's essentially correct.
I love that. You both of you guys bring up some interesting things, whether they're true on some of them. You know, this is the point. Let's throw it around. Let's play around with this stuff. And you're right. I would definitely suggest Creating Christ, checking out the book. For people who are like me, who even have a tough time going along with reading, don't worry. I can promise you there's a picture at least every 4 or 5 pages.
It's a picture book.
Yay! You know, I get to the picture and I take extra long time. I'm like, I gotta read again. Damn it! But seriously, it's a great book. I really, really enjoyed that. And then, of course, I can't wait for God the Father Has a Father.
Oh, what a great title, huh?
But seriously, you guys are serious heretics. You need to repent. I'm going to call the Pope tomorrow and make sure that you guys,
exercise.
Dr.
Call it an exorcist, right?
Yeah.
Truly, I would consider myself, honestly, a master of none, jack of all trades. The crazy thing about Dr. Bob is he's a master of all of these positions and sticks to none of them definitively. That tells you the more you know, I feel, the more you feel like you're more skeptical of how powerful some of this is. So I tried to get it into his head. I was like, Dr. Bob, why can't you just say what I want you to say real quick? You know, just say it. Just say that Titus is the Son of Man predicted to come, and 40 years later, and blah blah blah. And he's like, well, it seems like it's a very probable, possible. And I'm like, no, I need to hear you say it.
Can I pin you down on something?
And, yeah, you can. Yeah, I live in North Carolina.
Well,
I think I'm talking to someone right now.
I can see the problem with that Son of Man thing, though, because in a way that could be seen as being similar to Judas the Galilean himself.
Right.
Or even his son Menahem.
Right,
Judas,
of course. These rebel leaders all saw themselves as messianic figures, as the fulfillment of Daniel's prophecy. This is the rule, right, that Daniel predicted.
Well,
yeah.
I understand Price. I understand why he'll say probable and not say all the way, because
he's gangster.
If
he's OG, man. He really is.
If
no question.
If you look at the whole thing and not just look at one-sided, you'll probably get closer to the facts.
Yeah. No question.
Cherry picking.
Right. Exactly.
I love you guys. We're about to close out. Any last words?
Love you too, man.
No. Jacob's doing exciting work, and I can't wait to read it all, man.
Repent.
Thank you.
I love you guys. Seriously. Thanks.
Love you too, man. Bye.
Myth Vision Podcast. We are Myth Vision.